So we can see that that this world as nature picture, which had retained its constancy and solidity all through the Baroque, as something very solid and classical, almost like a work of classical music, is beginning to crumble, fall apart, and break down, just like Valhalla does at the end of Wagner's opera Götterdämmerung. The whole thing just collapses and falls apart, just as it's collapsing and falling apart in the realm of the arts, as we've seen, and in philosophy. And he begins to sketch out then, he says he wants to sketch out the remainder of the development of science. Based on what happened in the classical world, he wants to sketch out what we have to look forward to. And he says that what will happen as this process continues to crumble and unfold is that the culture will cease to announce itself in great intellects. It will cease to produce great high intellects who have full command of all the basic form problems in the field. And there will be fewer and fewer of them, and more of these small, specialized micro-investigators who investigate, spend all their time and work investigating these little tiny areas of knowledge, who cannot see the big picture. And the whole thing will crumble and disintegrate into this fragmentation with all these little scribblers and these Alexandrian researchers fathoming the world picture in terms of their own areas of specialization, and none of them seeing how the big picture fits together. Then he says that the individual will renounce during this period eventually by laying books aside. The culture ceases to manifest itself in great intellects. And you can see this, he says, as you move, as the Hellenistic period moved from Eratosthenes and Archimedes, who circa 200 BC were still great metaphysical creators, down to Posidonius and Pliny, who were collectors of taste, down then further to Ptolemy and Galen, who were mere copyists. And so this gradual cooling off of the intellect, this entropic cooling down of the intellect, is something that gradually takes place until it moves into the final stage of the second religiousness, where knowledge simply disappears from the stage altogether, and we begin to get a belief and piety in the salvation of the soul, begins to take front and center stage, and begins to become the main preoccupation instead of theory. And then he says that the sciences will gradually overlap. Each of the disciplines will slowly merge into each of the others, physiology into chemistry, the entropy principle into chemistry with this idea of the half-life of elements, physics, chemistry, physiology, epistemology, all will begin to penetrate and overlap with each other until they all arrive at a complete consistency of results, a final inner picture. This decrepit, decaying world image will finally disintegrate, but it'll be internally consistent. All the disciplines will arrive at the same results, one by one. And then so we have a morphology of the exact sciences that will need to be written to study this process of this breakdown. And then so he concludes at the end by prophesying this, that the Western scientific tradition will break down due to all of its internal contradictions, and there will be this slow cooling off and this final period of simply collecting knowledge. Once we get to the end of this, knowledge is simply collected the same way in works of art. In Constantine, for example, building his triumphal arch by robbing other already pre-made works of art and simply putting them in there. Same thing with knowledge when it comes down to the mere scribe, the copyist, who just collects what has already been thought out by others. That stage is still ahead of us, but probably not much further ahead of us. I think that our age is one that has indeed ceased to produce the great intellect. The great intellect, the Goethe or the Leonardo or even a Spengler himself, someone who can see all the form problems in all the domains of knowledge and see how they fit together. I think we're losing that ability now. Specialization is doing exactly what Spengler had said it would do. It's getting worse and worse and worse. Fewer and fewer of these academics can intercommunicate with each other, and they all go their own ways. And this is part of what I think has happened in postmodernism with the announcement by Lyotard of the decline of the grand meta-narrative. The grand meta-narrative was precisely, and Spengler, what we've been studying here all along, is a grand meta-narrative, is precisely what makes sense out of everything. And when those decline and disappear, it's not a good thing. Contrary to what the postmodernists want you to believe, it's not a good thing at all. it's a symptom of the decline of the mind of the civilization. It's breaking down because it's losing command of these form worlds, these vast form worlds, and it can no longer produce intellects that can gather all this stuff together. I mean, the sequel to Spengler is Foucault, I suppose, and Foucault has a similar kind of eclectic mentality where he has all this command of all these different Western form worlds, but we note from Spengler to Foucault a shrinking in the horizon of knowledge, vastly. It telescopes down in Foucault to a Eurocentric knowledge database. Foucault didn't know anything about any other civilization, not even a jot, not even an iota about any other civilization in history except for the West. And his specialty in the West, he himself, even though he announces in the archaeology of knowledge the end of this kind of historical way of doing things, this historical big picture thing, I think it's a confession of incompetence, actually, is what it amounts to. I think it's a confession that the Western mind is getting tired of doing this sort of thing, and in that respect, I think it is announcing exactly what Spengler predicted would happen. Foucault builds a meta-narrative where he sees this movement in the West from the sovereign kingly society to the disciplinary societies of the 18th and 19th centuries, which were his specialty, to the biopolitical age that comes after that, which is the age of statistics and the manipulation of populations through the study of statistical behavior. And it's a kind of meta-narrative in and of itself, because each of these epochs has its own episteme with its own knowledge type and its own discourse and its own knowledge apparatuses. But it's a vast shrinking of knowledge base by comparison to somebody like a Spengler or Rudolf Steiner or a Goethe. So I don't see this as a positive thing. I don't see that postmodern philosophy for the most part represents something greater than the philosophers of the metaphysical age that ended here with Spengler, more or less, with Spengler and Heidegger and Toynbee, and then in America we had Lewis Mumford and Joseph Campbell and Marshall McLuhan. All that type of way of doing things in terms of seeing the grand picture of civilization is dead. It is thermodynamically exhausted itself. It's dead and it's exhausted and it's no longer even a knowledge ideal. And I don't think it's a good thing. I think it's a confession of incompetence. I think it's a confession of the fact that nobody wants to spend any time anymore learning all of this stuff. Nobody wants to sit down and read the history of Indian philosophy and see whether it relates to the history of Western philosophy in some kind of interesting way. It's too much work. And I think there has been a real decline of knowledge. I think postmodernism and critical theory in particular represent a sharp telescoping and narrowing of knowledge and a Eurocentrism that is almost narcissistic. It's a kind of Eurocentric narcissism to the degree to which it holds up the mirror. It's the European mind holding up the mirror to itself and examining its teeth and seeing what looks. I mean, it's to that degree it has no relationship whatsoever to the history of knowledge in any of these other civilizations, and it pretends that anyone who has any kind of history in learning about the knowledge systems of these other civilizations must have something wrong with them. They must either be a New Ager or an archaic holdover, a vestige from a metaphysical age that no longer does that sort of thing. And of course, modern individuals who do this type of thing, like Ken Wilber, are bad examples because they're not very good at it. Somebody like William Irwin Thompson, who was very good at it when he was doing this type of thing, he doesn't do it anymore, was of the essence of, he continued this tradition, and it is very possible that William Irwin Thompson is the last dying representative of this tradition of seeing the big knowledge picture and seeing how the different disciplines fit together. So I think we're living in an age now which is thermodynamically cooling off, intellectually speaking. We're living in an age of specialists, and our philosophers are concerned with little tiny areas of knowledge, little micro-narratives, as Foucault put it. I don't think it's a good thing. I don't in any way see it as an improvement. I think it's a very bad thing. It's a shrinkage and a loss of horizons. And I think it's only going to pave the way for the coming of the second religiousness, which will be, when it gets here, a full abdication of the intellect altogether. We'll see forms of book burnings. We're already seeing with the arrival of electronic culture, and this is what I wrote my book, The New Media Invasion, about. With the arrival of electronic culture and all these new gadgets, we're seeing a kind of internal burning of the books by a wiping out of all the traditional accoutrement of the Gutenberg galaxy, the printed book, the bookstore. All these things are disappearing. Nobody seems to be too upset or concerned about it except good old-fashioned literary people such as myself. And I think it's a bad thing, but I think it's consistent with what Spengler predicted here. I think everything that he predicted, or nearly everything that he predicted would happen, has happened and is in process of happening. People just don't see it because A, they don't read Spengler anymore, he's not fashionable, and B, they don't seem to care. They're too interested in their gadgets and all the neat little things that they can do to be aware that these gadgets are actually have technology is nihilistic. It liquidates culture, it liquidates traditional values, and that's what it's in process of doing. And before you know it, pretty soon, the person sitting in a lighted cafe reading a book is going to be an object of ridicule. It's almost to that point now that people will walk by and say, what's that person doing with that book? What is this guy, an old timer? So that's where things are headed now. I think it's a scary age. It's an age of knowledge extermination. I think Spengler was the one man who saw it coming, and I think that's why he still needs to be read and studied, despite the old-fashioned meta-historical nature, the link with the whole epoch of German resistance to modernity, all these things which tend to date him and put him in that category. I think nonetheless these aspects of his philosophy that predicted what was coming to happen and what has since happened make it necessary, I think, to read and study him to see what's happened. But it could be the case that the very fact of him falling out of fashion and people not wanting to read this anymore is itself part of the process of entering into historical amnesia. And it's insidious. This idea almost that is beginning to dawn on us and settle upon us is this sort of twilight consciousness, this amnesic, aphasic consciousness, this will to forget the past, to let it go, and to begin the process of wiping the brain clean, wiping the mind rather, wiping it clean of knowledge structures. I think that may be part of this process of people's resistance to reading old-fashioned meta-historians and meta-philosophers, meta-narrativistic philosophers like Spengler. I think that's what this is tantamount to, and I think it's a sad thing. So anyway, that's volume 1 of Spengler's Decline of the West, and we'll stop there.